Okay, and so it all begins in Rails with the Rails command. So Rails is not only a set of libraries, it's also installed as a CLI, a command line interface, when you install the Rails gem. So we get the Rails app. And so every new Rails project begins with a Rails new, and we're going to make a Ghostbuster app. So we're going to call it Ghostbusters. And so Rails new Ghostbusters will create a new project in a folder named after Ghostbusters. So if I hit that, that's where we go. Some of the things that I go over today, if you want to reference those, you'll be able to see these things in the Getting Started Rails guide up on the Rails Guides website. There's also our Rails overview notes. So if you look in Learn and you look up the Rails overview notes, the Rails overview notes are sort of like a high level snapshot of a bunch of the things that we end up doing in Rails. Your startup may take a little bit longer than mine. So I've run Rails new recently, meaning that I have likely the latest version of a lot of the gems. You might not have the latest version of a lot of the gems. I only had to install one new gem. The rest of them I already had the latest and greatest of all of them. Yours might sit there and have to sort of download or even compile some of the other gems. If I do an ls though, we'll see that there's a new folder here. And so I can navigate to that new folder. By default, this folder is already Git enabled. So the Git version control system is already set up and ready to go. So we could type git status in that folder and it'll tell us that there are a bunch of files that haven't yet been managed by Git. The other thing I'm going to want to do is I'm in my file picker inside of VS Code and I'm going to add this folder from my full stack folder, Rails Ghostbusters, add that in there. Yours is still going? Okay, well, while that happens, you don't have to copy what I'm going to do for Git stuff, but I am going to post this repository up on GitHub afterwards so that it'll be paired with the video. So what I'm going to do to make sure that all these files are managed and tracked by Git is I'm going to do a git add command that stages all of these files that were just added to this folder. And then I'm going to take a snapshot of the state of my project with a git commit. I can also do this kind of git stuff from VS Code. You'll see me do that throughout as well. And so I'll just say initial commit, and that takes the snapshot of the project. So I'm in the Ghostbusters directory. I've navigated there. If I do an ls, we'll see, or if you look over here at the Idle Explorer, we can see the different folders that are present in all Rails applications. There's always an app, a bin, a config, a DB, a lib, a log, a public, a storage, a temp, a test, and a vendor. We're going to spend most of our time this term in app and in config and in DB. Those are the ones that we do all of our work in. The app folder is where our assets live. So images and JavaScript and CSS go into that assets folder. The controllers folder is where our controllers go. And same thing goes for our models and our views. So a lot of the work we'll do today and throughout the term is happening in this app folder. The config folder is suitably for config stuff. We typically will just be working with this routes file. That's where our routing goes. So that's how we determine sort of what URLs map to what controller actions. We'll also do some work in this database YAML file, not initially, because initially it's set up for us by default to use SQLite. But when we go to production and we maybe want to switch over to a database like Postgres, it's in this file where we will set the database credentials and which database adapter to use. And the other folder we'll spend time in is this DB folder, which is where our database, our SQLite database will go, and it's also where our migrations go. And I'll talk a little bit later on today what migrations are and how they let us make changes to our database. The other folder that you might touch on occasion is this public folder, and it's just a place where any file you put here will be served out without going through Rails' routing system. So if you have just plain old static files that aren't addressed by your assets, like a static file that's not an image or a JavaScript or a style sheet, you put them in this public directory. So if you had just like a PDF document that was a static document that you wanted to serve up, you could put it in here.
What are the .keep files?
The .keeps are a weird way of working with Git. Git won't manage folders if they're empty, and so if you just put a .keep in there, then there's something in there, and Git will start paying attention to that directory. Git won't manage empty directories. So it's just a way of dealing with that. Okay. So what I want to do is I want to create, and I'm going to do this by way of scaffolding. So scaffolding is what I demoed earlier on in this course, where we have Rails write for us the controller, the model, and the views. When you're new to Rails, it's normal to sort of lean on scaffolding, but the more you use Rails, the less and less you'll use scaffolding, because you often don't need all of what it generates for you. But it's an impressive way to get started with Rails because it does a lot of the setup work for you. So I want a database of ghosts. So I'm going to go to the Rails CLI and say Rails G for generate. And I could spell out the word generate if I wanted to, but G works. And what do I want to generate? I want to generate a scaffold. And it's a scaffold for what? It's a scaffold for a ghost. And what is a ghost? Well, let's just say that a ghost has a name, which is going to have a string, and a description, which is going to be text. Now we could give ghosts all sorts of other properties. We're not tied down. If we just pressed enter here, a ghost wouldn't be tied down to this forever. We can add, we can change the properties at a later time. But this is just, we're going to keep things simple. So every ghost is going to have a name. String in the database world is going to become a varchar, and text will stay as a text data type. So that's sort of the type. So if, for example, we also had, I don't know if ghosts have ages, but we could also say like age integer or something along those lines. But we'll just keep things simple. We'll give those two things. What also will be created in the database is going to be an ID, which is going to be an auto-incrementing primary key, and two timestamps, a created at and an updated at timestamp, and those get managed by the system for us. Yeah. Oh, make sure you're inside of the project folder. So you have to navigate to the Ghostbusters folder with like CD space Ghostbusters. Otherwise, this command won't work. And so I hit enter, and a flurry of new files are going to be created, and we'll sort of see what they are, because it'll specify which files were created or modified after running this command. This warning here, I haven't been able to make it go away. It seems to have something to do with the Windows subsystem for Linux. I don't get it when I run Rails under straight up Linux. I don't get it when I run Rails in Mac OS. So it doesn't seem to affect my project though. It doesn't make the project break in any way. So I ignore it. Tried to make it go away once, and just other error messages and warnings came up in its stead. So I was like, okay, I can't get rid of it. So you can see a bunch of files and folders were created or modified. In the DB folder, we got a migrate folder that had a create ghosts file. In the models folder, there is a model that's been created. Some routes were added, tests were added, views were added. We're going to look at most of these things in turn. We're going to start by looking in the DB folder, in this migrate folder, and open the file that's in there. File name starts with a really long number. It turns out that number is a timestamp. So if you break it down, it's like 2019, month, day, year, and some time associated with it. But after that, it's describing what we're doing. It's weird, I'm getting little output error messages here, but this is how Rails manages changes to your database. So the database does not yet exist. There is no ghosts table yet in my database, but when I run this migration, what it's going to do is it's going to create a table called ghosts. That table will have a name, which is a string. It'll have a column called a description, which is text. The timestamps will be there, and then the primary key will be there as well. So to get this migration to run, I run at the command line Rails db:/migrate. And if you look at Rails tutorials, you'll sometimes see slightly older tutorials will say rake db migrate, as in R-A-K-E, and that's because rake is in the Ruby community a task runner. It's actually still what's doing the work here, but newcomers to Rails would get very confused as to when to use the Rails command and when to use the rake command, and so they just made it so that the Rails command sort of mediates all tasks, and if it needs to use rake, it'll call rake for us. So I'll run this. That runs any outstanding migrations. You can see output that it created that ghost table. In that folder, we now have a development.sqlite3 file. That's where that ghosts table was created. If I tried to run Rails db migrate again, the system is smart enough to know that that migration has already been invoked, and so it doesn't invoke it again. And I can also do things like redo, and that'll like redo a migration. I can do a migration and specify a timestamp, allowing me to roll back in time. So sometimes you have to work on an older version of your app and you want your database to be versioned back in time to a particular time. And so you can say version and then you pick one of the timestamps and it rolls your database to exist back in time. So it can be used really nicely in conjunction with a Git versioning system. So you can roll your code back and you can roll your database back. It's a destructive action to the database, right? You might lose data. And I could even say version 0, and that'll just take me back to having no tables. There is now a new file in this DB folder, which is called schema.rb. And this is the file you go to if you want a quick overview of your database schema. It's a file that you do not alter. I'm getting all sorts of weird solar graph. I just upgraded my... Okay, so do I have to disable it now? It's just annoying me. Solar graph. But not likely. Okay, so let me just reload this. And there we are.
Now it just displays all the errors all the time.
So don't edit this file. Don't assume that you can make changes to your database schema by modifying this file. This file is just a way of showing you what exists. And another thing that can be done with this file is if someone like comes onto your project after a whole bunch of tables exist, they don't have to run through all of your migrations, which might do a variety of changes over time. They can just load up the database as it is defined in this schema. And this version right here is just that timestamp. This is how Rails actually knows which of the migrations it's already run and which it hasn't. So that's the same as that timestamp at the front of the migration that we ran. And you can see here, that's the state of my table. Okay, before I start looking at things like the controllers and the models and the views, let's get a little bit of data into this ghost table so that there's some data present when we bring this system up as a web application already. I can do this in two places. I'll first do it at the command line. And so I'll run a Rails C, which stands for Rails console. And what the Rails C is it is a version of IRB, which is the interactive Ruby prompt, but with the Rails development environment loaded up. And by that I mean we have access to our models, right? So I can go to the ghost model and ask it to count the rows in the ghosts table. And there are none, and it shows me the SQL. But I could now go and I could create a ghost. And so I could say Slimer and a description, a green and slimy ghost, sometimes friendly. So that's ghost with a capital G dot create. This is the command which will create the object but also persist it as long as it's valid. We haven't set up any validation, so it should be valid. And then name colon, and there's the string that I'm setting the name to, comma, description colon, the second string. Make sure if you're using single quotes, you don't have any other single quotes used within the string. You'd have to escape those. And the parentheses are, of course, optional, but I like to use them. And if I do this, get an insert statement. So I've inserted a new ghost. And I can do a ghost.count, and I should be told that there's one. I could find that ghost, Slimer equals ghost.first. And I could even modify, right? I could change the name, and then I could do a .save. So like I can do all sorts of database exploring and manipulation from this console. It's a really handy tool, especially at the beginning of a project, just to test to see if things are working for you. When I'm running a Rails application, I'll often just leave a console running and then open up another prompt. In the second prompt, I will run the Rails server with a Rails S. So I still have the first prompt open running Rails C. Now the second prompt running Rails S. This boots up our development server on port 3000 using a project called Puma, which is an HTTP server implemented in Ruby. You can see here it's listening on port 3000 of my local host. And then I'm going to open a third terminal. So I typically have 3 terminals running, 4 if I'm running test-driven development cycle, but we don't do that in this course, but I'll often have one that's just sort of always watching and running my tests for me. And in this one, I can type other Rails commands. So if I need to generate new things, make changes to my database, add new controllers, I would do it at this third terminal. With our server up and running, so I go back to terminal number 2 here, I should be able to go to Chrome or any browser and load up localhost 3000. And the default for the root route, so the route where there is no path after the domain, is just this "yay, you're on Rails" message. This just lets you know that your server's working. Rails space S. And again, you have to be in the Ghostbuster folder for that to work. Rails space server also works. This is there. I don't think there is a physical file in your project for this. It's probably part of just the Rails gem. So I don't think you can modify this in any way. And we tend to overwrite it as one of the first things we do. We go and we can set a new root route for our application. If I go to /ghosts, I have a route that has been created for me automatically when I ran my scaffold generator that set up a route that matches the name of my table. And you can see in here, make this a little bit bigger, I already have a ghost in the system, one that I added at the command prompt. And I can show its unique page, so it has a permalink of ghost/1, that 1 being the primary key of this. Yeah, there are sometimes security implications of using auto-incrementing primary keys, especially if you're using them for things like users. But for data, I don't see it as being that big of a problem, unless you want to hide that data from other people, right? If there is a problem with sequential IDs being guessable, in some situations for sure. Edit allows me to edit, right? So I could put an exclamation mark here if I wanted to, and I could update that ghost. Takes me back to its permalink. If I go back, that takes me to the index page. New brings me to here. Marshmallow Man. Soft and puffy. And I can create this ghost, edit it as well. You can see its permalink is ghost/2. You can override how your permalinks work, and I often will use there's a gem called friendly ID, which makes them into like more human readable. And so it would use, like, you could set it up so that the slug was a URL encoded version of the name or something like that. And yeah, it's makes it like a friendly readable URL. It'll still put the ID in there though. It'll be the ID and the other thing. But you could, anything with Rails that exists by default can be overridden. But the defaults work in 90% of all cases. And so these two things are in my database. I could go back to my console if I wish to, and I could find that second Marshmallow Man ghost, ghost.last. There's the Marshmallow Man. You can see it has the ID 2, which is why it was found at ghost/2. And I could make a change here from my command prompt. I could say like m.description plus equals often yummy, and then m.save. That will update the ghost in the database only when I do the .save. And if I go back over to the website of things and reload it, that change is reflected there because it's pulling from the same database. So now we have a fully functioning CRUD application. We could push this live to the internet now if we wanted to. There's no authentication, right? This is wide open. Adding simple auth is quite easy. You can add that at a controller level with like a hard-coded username and password if you just wanted to get something up really simply. Later on in this course, we use a gem called Devise that adds authentication to applications in a really nice way. But we're going to just leave it open like this, and we're going to explore the controller and the model and the views that go into how this all operates, because yes, it's magical that this was all generated for us, but we get to look behind the scenes and sort of see how all of this works. So although it's magical, the files exist and we can go look at them and modify them. And so if you remember when we were, one second. Here. When I first started talking about Rails, I drew a diagram similar to this one on the board. The requests are coming in from the internet. They're hitting our server. First level is routing. Routing goes to controller. Controller optionally interfaces with a model, which generates SQL for us that interfaces with a database. That data is passed back to the controller. If it's saved as an instance variable, it gets handed off to the associated view. The view is a templating environment where we can inject Ruby, and the view is just the body of the HTML document, and there's also a layout that is the full HTML document that the view gets injected into, and that's what gets returned to the end user. So we'll take a moment to look at each piece of this puzzle in the scaffolded application. The routing one is going to look a little bit magical because it's going to boil down to, I believe, a single line of routing, but we can tease that apart at a later date. But we'll at least go look at what that is. So the routing exists in the config folder. in the routes.rb. This is just regular old Ruby. Sometimes Rails uses Ruby as its config files. Sometimes Rails uses YAML for its config files. And so you'll see like the database file, for example, is a .yml. And YAML is yet another markup language. That's what the YAML stands for. So yeah, you'll see some YAML files, some just plain old Ruby. This one's just plain old Ruby with what's called a DSL, a domain-specific language. So like the word resources is not a Ruby keyword. That's part of our DSL for setting up routes. When we, in this routing file, say something like resources ghosts, what that does is Rails is going to set, so this sets up RESTful routing for the ghosts resource. You may have seen this term REST before in your travels online, or if you were working, doing web stuff. It stands for representational state transfer. It's a way of building web applications that works with HTTP. And it's going to build a whole bunch of URLs that are going to map to our different controller actions. Those we'll look into in more detail at a later time. Just know that this one line, this sets up 7 different URL routes are defined with this one line. And if we go to our controller, we'll see 7 different actions, which are just the methods in the controller that map to each one of those routes. And above each one of them is going to be a comment that specifies what the route is. So if you go into your app controller, you'll see a ghosts controller. It inherits from something called application controller, which is actually in the same folder. An application controller does nothing more than inherit from action controller base. So we use application controller as a place to stash things that we want all controllers to inherit from. So it just sits itself in sort of the object hierarchy as a place where we can put things that we want common to all controllers. Really nice for authentication, right? Because you can hook authentication in here at the application controller level, and all controllers inherit from there. That's in the same in the controllers folder in the app subfolder. And here you'll see the 7 RESTful routes. So a GET request to /ghosts goes to this index. And this is that part of the puzzle where you can go to the model, right? So if you think about the controller, now it's going to the model. That's happening here. When we go to /ghosts, which you already saw me do, the model is invoked and we find all the ghosts, right? And we could change this to be like, yeah, find all the ghosts, but like order them by name. And that gets saved to this @ variable, and @vars are automatically shared with the associated view. And in this case, the associated view is in the app views ghosts index.html.erb file. So in the views folder, there is a subfolder for our current controller, ghost controller. All the files are called html.erb, and then their name maps to the name. We won't go through all these other ones, but you can see there are actions for creating and updating and destroying. Let's just take a quick peek into the model and the view, and then our tour will be done. The model, at least to begin with, is empty. The model file inherits from application record, which is in the same folder. It's just like that application controller. It's a place where you can stash things that are common to all of your models, and it in turn inherits from active record base. So when we were working with active record outside of Rails, we just inherited directly from active record base. But the ghost model, it's empty. you know, we could put a validation in here. We could say validates that the name has a presence requirement of true. And then the very last piece of this puzzle is the view. How is this data here being displayed? Well, this instance variable gets automatically shared with the view. That's Rails throwing object-oriented conventions to the wind, right? Normally, instance variables are private, encapsulated, but they just get magically shared with our views. And so let's go take a quick peek at this view. It's right here. It's the index.html. This is what is displaying right here. So if I changed this h1 from ghosts to my ghosts and reloaded it, that changed. The order of the ghosts also changed because I changed the order in the controller statement. So now instead of Slimer being first, the Marshmallow Man is first because I asked for them to be ordered alphabetically. And so here you can see the view as a template language. This is where Rails looks a lot like PHP, where instead of like less than % PHP tags, or sorry, less than question mark PHP tags, we have these less than % tags and less than % equals echo tags. This is how we're looping through our ghosts, grabbing each ghost and echoing out their name. It's a mixture of Ruby and HTML, just like we were used to in PHP. Very, very similar. David Heinemeier Hansson, the creator of Rails, pulled this idea directly from PHP. He was a PHP programmer before he was a Ruby programmer. And yeah, that's the high-level overview of a scaffolded Rails application where we get a full CRUD app after just typing in that one line. In the rest of this course, we're going to dig in deeper and we're going to learn how to build all those pieces on our own. And we're also going to learn how to build up other things like admin systems that manage our whole backend with a login system and everything. And we'll use gems for a lot of that. And so that's all I got for us for this overview. So I will